starting with the latest on the transition from our chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl, our chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, our chief investigative correspondent, Brian Ross. And John, let me begin with you. We now know that Mike Pence, Vice President-elect Mike Pence, is going to be in charge of the transition, replacing Chris Christie. Next big decision, chief of staff, and the two names talked about the most, Steve Bannon, Reince Priebus, both allies, but they send quite a different message.
And, George, I am told that decision could come as soon as today. It is hard to imagine a choice more stark than the choice between Reince Priebus, the chairman of the Republican Party, a clear establishment figure, and Stephen Bannon, a leader of the right-wing, Breitbart News Network, somebody who spent most of the time beating up on the Republican establishment. I can tell you, George, that congressional leaders on the Republican side are hoping it is Priebus. They see Priebus as somebody who they can clearly work with. But conservative activists, Tea Party activists, are threatening Donald Trump that if he chooses Reince Priebus, he will lose much of his base of support. They are telling him not to do that. They want Bannon, somebody who has spent much of the past 2 years trying to destroy Speaker of the House Paul Ryan.
And who knows, he may surprise us and pick someone else. But as you say, the decision is imminent. It sort of gets to the broader question as well of, now that the Republicans will control the White House and both houses of Congress, where does President Trump defer to those Republican leaders? Where does he take them on?
Well, the Republican leadership is quite hopeful at this time that they will have wide latitude. Trump is a big visionary guy, not a detail guy, obviously. They are preparing to charge ahead with a Republican, a conservative agenda that Paul Ryan talked about a lot on the campaign trail. Of course, again, a lot of that will depend on who the person is on Trump's, Trump's right-hand side, whether it's Bannon or whether it's Priebus.
Not too many clues from Trump himself in this first week. He mentioned infrastructure, he mentioned immigration and jobs, and then on Obamacare, but says he both wants to replace it and repeal it, but talked about preserving those, the pre-existing condition ban and this idea that kids can stay on their on their parents' plan until the age of 26.
Yeah, from the conservatives, the battle cry for the last couple of years, especially from people like Ted Cruz, was repeal Obamacare, every single word of Obamacare. That is not the message from Donald Trump. And on infrastructure, there's a potential for him to reach out to Democrats. He's talking about infrastructure spending far in excess of what any Republicans would have considered under a Democratic president. So you have some mixed signals. The other thing I would add to that list, George, I am told that very early on in this transition process to expect that Trump will announce his nominee for the Supreme Court. That will be something designed to very much please conservatives, even as they may get a little nervous on some of what he's talking about in terms of Obamacare and infrastructure.
Okay, John, thanks. Let's move on to national security now with Martha Raddatz. And personnel is going to matter so much here as well. Our next guest, Rudy Giuliani, talked about possibly a Secretary of State. You've got this General Mike Flynn, who is a loyalist, considered for national security advisor perhaps, but also talk about some establishment figures like George W. Bush's national security advisor, Steve Hadley, for Department of Defense.
Steve Hadley, that's an outlier for sure, but he's very experienced. He may be national security advisor, but I think that would be a hard choice for Mr. Trump to make, President-elect Trump to make, because General Flynn, he's very comfortable with. And in that position, you have to be very comfortable with someone like that whispering in your ear about national security. So I think General Flynn is probably the top contender for that job. Secretary of State, maybe they would consider Steve Hadley for that job. Richard Haass. There are people who aren't head of the Council on Foreign Relations and certainly an administration official many years ago under George H.W. Bush. But I think all of these things, George, there are always names floated. Newt Gingrich's name is out there. Sometimes you just want to make the loyalists happy by floating those names. I think this will play out over the next several weeks. But obviously, this is a huge decision. This is where he has the least experience and will have to rely on people with experience.
Has made some major promises as well, said he would rip up the Iran nuclear agreement, renegotiate NAFTA.
Well, I think they would really like to rip up that agreement and get a new one, but that's going to be very difficult. You, of course, have Russia involved in that. And I think the question is, what do they do in the meantime? I listened this week, Rick Grinnell, who is an old UN hand, talk on Fox News about really pressing to see if the Iranians are violating any of the terms of the agreement. Really press them on that, make sure there is full compliance. So I think you'll see that in the coming months immediately, that they will just talk tougher. NAFTA, another thing that's awfully hard.
We've got American advisors on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Trump suggesting to the Wall Street Journal that he would stop aiding the rebels fighting Assad. Comfort to Putin there.
Comfort to Putin there. And again, so what does he do? President-elect Trump has promised a safe zone, a humanitarian zone. Do you put U.S. troops on the ground? Do you try to get other troops on the ground? And he's also promised an intelligence surge. Mike Flynn knows a lot about that. Tactically, Mike Flynn has been fantastic with intelligence when he was in the military. They'll be looking at that. But if you have really good intelligence, that truly does mean putting troops on the ground in some way.
Let's move on to the legal issues now with Brian Ross. 4,500 outstanding lawsuits now for Donald Trump, including Trump University, in court this week.
That's right, George. Well, he was a major real estate developer, and they sue and get sued all the time. And of those hundreds of lawsuits, we're told 30 are significant. There's pressure for him to settle that suit before he goes into office. That could happen. As well, we know as a real estate developer, he has hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, in loans. He borrows money from all kinds of people around the world, including more than $100 million from a German bank now under federal investigation.
The question's also about his business. He has said it's going to be given to his children to run. At the same time, we saw his children appointed this week to formal roles in the transition. A lot of ethics experts looking at it and saying that is not a blind trust.
Experts on both sides, both parties say that, George, that he's going to turn over the operation to his three children, Donald Jr., Eric, and Ivanka. That's not a blind trust, according to the experts we talked to. They're involved now in choosing the next government. It's really a situation that no other president has had in years and years. He clearly is not going to follow the idea that generally there is no rule that requires this, but there generally is a situation which people are required to put their interest to the side so they don't have a conflict.
Yeah, all recent presidents have done that. But as you point out, the president is exempt from the conflict of interest rules that all other administration officials must abide by.
Right. It's a common practice, but not required by law.
Okay, Brian Ross, Martha, thank you very much. Jonathan Karl as well.